Colonel Frank Briggs threw his signature heavy straight right at Chuck Norris, the same punch that had ended a man in a Saigon alley back in 1967. The punch traveled through empty air. Chuck was 2 paces past where Briggs had aimed, breathing easy. No white gi top, just black trousers and red Korean dirt on his bare feet. Briggs reset and threw a left hook with everything in his shoulder. The hook found nothing. 800 airmen stood at parade rest, watching the chief hand-to-hand instructor of Osan Air Base swing 4 times in 12 seconds without touching a man 8 years out of the United States Air Force. Briggs had run the parade ground on the south end of the 51st Composite Wing for 11 straight years, and in that time, no man on that base had ever taken a sparring round off him. But on that 92-degree morning in August of 1970, in front of his 800 airmen and a Korean Grand Master in the second row, he could not put a hand on a 30-year-old man in plain black gi pants and bare feet. And what happened in the next 90 seconds on that red Korean clay was the worst 90 seconds of the colonel's career, and the 800 airmen watching were never going to let him forget it. Earlier that morning, Chuck Norris had not flown into Osan expecting to fight anyone. The whole trip had been arranged by Pacific Air Forces over the spring as part of a directive evaluating civilian martial arts instructors for inclusion in the hand-to-hand combat curriculum across the Pacific Commands. 3 instructors had been invited to the base that summer. Chuck Norris was the second of them. At 30 years old, he was already the 3-time professional world middleweight karate champion. The studios in Burbank had started calling, and as the C-130 taxied past the row of F-4 Phantoms on the flight line that morning, Chuck was looking out the small portside window at the same access road he had marched along 11 years earlier as a 19-year-old airman first class out of Ryan, Oklahoma. The dirt under the wheels of the aircraft was the same dirt where, in 1959, he had taken his first Tang Soo Do class under a Korean instructor named Jae Chul Shin, and decided he wanted to become serious about something for the rest of his life. Grandmaster Jae Chul Shin himself was sitting in the second row that morning. Chuck had asked the base commander to extend the invitation as a personal request. Shin had flown up from Seoul in a plain dark suit and taken his seat with his hands folded in his lap, watching his old student walk onto the demonstration platform without a word. The full weight of what walking back onto this dirt meant to Chuck was not something he had spoken about to anyone that morning. Some things do not need to be said out loud to land where they need to land. Now the man standing at the edge of the platform with arms folded and jaw set was Colonel Frank Briggs, 51 years old, 6'3", 230 pounds, 2 tours of Vietnam, 1 tour of Korea before that, currently serving as Air Police Commander. 3 bronze stars and 2 purple hearts on the ribbon bar of the blouse hung on the chair beside the platform. Fort Bragg combatives in the early 50s, back when the Army called it close quarters work. Golden Gloves in Indianapolis before that. Chief hand-to-hand instructor at Osan for 11 straight years. The kind of officer who had watched the Pacific Theater fill up with sport karate trophy chasers since around 1965, and despised every one of them. Black Belt magazine had run a 6-page profile of Chuck Norris that May and Briggs had read it twice. $1.50 had bought him a ticket to the Wrecking Crew at the base theater the previous year, and the experience had not improved his opinion. To the colonel, the worst kind of man was the one who had served honorably, taken his discharge, and gone to Hollywood to pretend at the thing real men actually did. For the first 40 minutes of Chuck's demonstration, Briggs stood at the edge of the platform with his arms folded across his chest. 800 airmen were watching Chuck show footwork drills and redirection and sensitivity work, the kind of Tang Soo Do fundamentals that look like Tai Chi to a man who wants them to look like Tai Chi. The airmen, though, were not watching Chuck. They were watching their colonel's face, and the colonel's face was telling them everything they needed to know about what he thought of what they were being shown. Then Briggs stepped onto the platform. There was no request, No pause in the drill, no warning. He walked into the center of the dirt, turned his back on Chuck Norris, and faced his 800 airmen directly. The speech that came out of him was the one that decided the morning. To Briggs, this was dancing. This was choreography for the Johnny Carson show. Point karate was tagged with bows, and Chuck Norris had built a career playing patty cake with other men in pajamas under rules that would get an airman killed in the first 10 seconds of a bar fight in Itaewon, let alone a firefight in the Mekong Delta. Real men had been getting shot at while Chuck had been collecting trophies. Real men had been losing friends in the Ia Drang Valley, while Chuck had been signing autographs in Burbank. For 10 years the colonel had watched men like this come through his base, and not once had he lost a round to any of them, and at 51 years old, he was not about to start now. Then he turned to Chuck for the first time. His voice carried to the back row without rising. "Mr. Norris, throw your best technique at me right now, in front of these airmen. If you put me down, I will learn from you, and so will every man on this parade ground. If you don't, you get on a C-141 tonight, and Pacific Air Forces finds itself instructors who have actually been shot at." The parade ground went silent. The only sound was the F-4 Phantoms running up on the flight line half a mile to the east. Chuck had been called out by name, in front of 800 men, in front of Jae-chul Shin, in the second row, on the dirt where he had become himself 11 years earlier. There was no door out of this room that did not pass through humiliation. Chuck did not look for one. He turned his head a quarter inch toward Briggs and spoke. The first row heard him. The rest of the parade ground did not. Something to the effect of, "You have been carrying this for a while, Colonel. Let us settle it and still get lunch." Briggs blinked once. The line was not what he had expected. There was no apology in it, and no escalation in it. The line simply offered to give him the encounter he had asked for, with the door to lunch left open on the other side. The white gi top came off and got folded once. Chuck handed it to a young airman first class standing at the front of the formation, who took it with both hands the way a man takes something he understands he is going to remember holding. The black gi pants stayed on. The feet stayed bare on the red Korean dirt. Briggs unbuttoned his service blouse and handed it to his aide. His sleeves got rolled to the elbow. He stepped onto the dirt in his trousers and his white undershirt. The stance he took was not a martial artist's stance. It was the stance the Army had taught him at Fort Bragg in 1953. Weight forward, hands open at chest level, the stance of a man who had put bodies on the floor for 31 years. Chuck took no stance at all, hands at his sides, weight even on both feet, eyes on the center of the colonel's chest, with the quiet attention of a man who had been in this exact situation many times. In the second row, Grandmaster Jae-chul Shin saw the stance his student had taken, which was no stance, and his face did not change. Briggs opened the way an Army combatives instructor opens. A measuring jab, then a step in for the clinch. Controlled and doctrinal, the exact entry he had taught 1,000 airmen on this exact dirt. The plan was to close, control the arms, drive the smaller man into the ground, where 230 pounds settles every argument that has ever been started. Chuck slipped the jab by 3 inches. On the clinch attempt, Chuck pivoted 45 degrees off the line. Pure Tang pseudo footwork, the redirection drill he had been demonstrating 90 seconds earlier. Briggs's hands closed on empty air. He reset. That entry had worked on 500 men in his career, and every one of them had been there to be grabbed. The first 15 seconds had told the colonel something he was not yet ready to accept. So he committed. A heavy overhand right came over the top. The same punch Briggs had used to end a North Korean infiltrator in an alley behind the Yongsan compound in 1953. Chuck slipped it by an inch. The follow-up was a left hook to the body, the kind that breaks ribs through a winter jacket. Chuck checked it with his elbow, did not deflect it, let the impact spend itself against bone. Briggs's face flickered. The contact was the first thing in 11 years that had hurt the colonel in his own demonstration. A three-punch combination came next. Jab, cross, hook. The exact combination Briggs had drilled airmen on for a decade. The first two missed. The third landed on Chuck's forearm. 30 seconds in, and Chuck still had not struck him. 800 airmen were watching their colonel throw the techniques he had taught them, in front of them, and not touch a man in plain black G-pants on the dirt. The Army doctrine Briggs had been teaching since '53 assumed two things about a fight. It assumed the other man was going to be there to be hit, and it assumed the other man was going to come forward to be grabbed. Tang Soo Do, the way Jay Chul-shin had taught it on this exact dirt in 1959, assumed neither. The whole system was built around the proposition that the most important inch in any fight is the inch the other man's punch travels through after your head has already moved. Chuck had spent 11 years living inside that inch. Briggs adjusted. He had to. He shortened his stance and brought his hands tighter to his chin, the boxing guard he had used at the Indianapolis Golden Gloves in 1949. He threw a stiff jab to the chest. No power, just a rangefinder. Chuck did not slip it. Chuck let it touch the cotton of his black guy pants at the hip and went nowhere, which was the worst thing Briggs could have seen, because it meant the smaller man was not just outside his reach. The smaller man was choosing, in real time, which of the colonel's punches were worth moving for and which ones were not. In the front row, Master Sergeant Earl Hooks felt his jaw tighten. He had stood at the edge of this exact platform for 6 years, watching Briggs throw that combination on hand-picked airmen, and not once in 6 years had he seen the third punch fail to land. The combination was muscle memory for the colonel. The combination did not miss. Hooks looked left at the captain standing beside him, and the captain looked back, and neither man said anything, because there was nothing to say that the dirt in front of them was not already saying louder. The information rippled backwards through the rows the way a stone drops through still water. By the time the next punch came, 300 of the men on that parade ground knew exactly what they were watching, and the other 500 were 1 second away from knowing. This was the turn. Briggs threw the hardest punch of his morning, a straight right with everything in his shoulder, the kind of punch a 230-pound colonel throws when his credibility is dying in real time. Chuck slipped it. As the punch traveled past his face, Chuck tapped Briggs lightly on the floating rib with an open right palm. The tap was not a strike, it was a correction. The same correction Chuck would give a stuntman named Frank Tarver on a Burbank pavement 6 years later. The tap said one thing only: I can hit you whenever I want. I am choosing not to. Every airman on the parade ground who knew anything about fighting understood what had just happened. Briggs felt it. His eyes flicked down to Chuck's hand. Another right came at full extension, and Chuck tapped him on the kidney as the punch traveled past. The colonel was breathing hard now. His undershirt was streaked dark with sweat across the back. 45 seconds of swinging at empty air, and the only contact in the fight had been Chuck's open palm, telling him where the fight could have ended twice already. Briggs did what an Army combat veteran does when striking fails. He shot for the takedown. A clean double leg, head down, drive through the hips, the way Fort Bragg had taught him in 1953, before the Army even called it that. It was correct technique. It was the right call. It would have worked on almost any man on the parade ground that morning. Chuck sprawled. A real sprawl. Hips back, weight down onto Briggs's shoulders, the same counter Chuck would show a Navy SEAL named Darrell Brennan on a Bud's grinder in Coronado 15 years later. The colonel's drive stopped dead in the dirt. He was on his hands and knees, with a smaller man's weight pressing down across his back. Chuck slid to side control. There was no throw, no strike, only a controlled transition that ended with Briggs face down on the red Korean clay, with Chuck's right knee a measured inch from his floating ribs, and Chuck's right palm flat across the back of his neck. The position got held for 2 seconds. the 2 seconds required to make the point unmistakable to 800 witnesses. Then Chuck released, stepped back 2 paces, and stood with his hands open at his sides. Briggs pushed himself up off the dirt. Slowly, the undershirt was soaked through and streaked with red ozone clay. There was blood at the corner of his mouth, where his teeth had cut the inside of his cheek on the sprawl. No look toward his aide, no look toward Chuck. He turned and looked at his 800 airmen. The silence stretched long enough that you could hear the F-4s on the flight line a half-mile away. Then he spoke, loud enough for the back row to hear every word. "Airmen, what you just saw is real. I attacked Mr. Norris with every technique I have taught you for the last 11 years. I attacked with the punch I ended a man with in 1953. I shot for a takedown the way Bragg taught me. I did not touch him once. He did not strike me once. He could have ended me 4 times in 90 seconds, and chose not to. That is the difference between what I have been teaching and what he is teaching. Starting Monday, we are going to learn this." Then the colonel turned to Chuck. His right hand came up to the brim of an imaginary cover. A full salute, from an 06 to a former airman first class, on the dirt of the base where that airman had learned to fight 11 years earlier. The 800 airmen saw it. In the second row, Grandmaster J. Chul Shin's face still did not change, but his eyes had. Chuck returned the salute. He crossed the platform to Briggs and stopped 2 feet in front of him. Something quiet passed between them that only the colonel heard. The words were short, the way Chuck had spoken to Tarver on the pavement in Burbank, the way Chuck would speak to Howard Jackson on the canvas at Long Beach. Whatever Chuck said gave Colonel Briggs back the part of himself the colonel believed he had just lost in front of his men. The reader does not need to be told what the words were. The structure of the moment carries it. Then Chuck walked off the platform. He crossed the parade ground in his bare feet and stopped in front of the second row. The bow he gave J. Chul Shin was not the bow of a champion. It was the bow of a student. Shin returned it. 2 sentences passed between them in Korean that the 800 airmen did not need to understand, and that neither of us needs to either. Briggs's aide had not moved the entire time. He had stood at the edge of the platform for 90 seconds holding the colonel's service blouse over one forearm, the ribbon bar facing out. Bronze star, purple heart, 11 years of hash marks, catching the early light the way it had every morning he had held it for him. He had held that blouse before staff meetings, before inspections, before the change of command. He had never held it during something like this. When Briggs stepped off the platform, the aide did what he always did. He held the blouse open, shoulders forward, the way you offer a coat to a man about to put his arms through the sleeves and become, again, the colonel. Briggs did not put his arms through the sleeves. He reached out and took the blouse from the aide's hands entirely and folded it once, lengthwise, over his own forearm, ribbons turned in against his body, where the nearest row of airmen could not read them. He had never folded his own blouse in front of his men in 11 years on that base. There had never been a reason to. 20 feet away, the young airman first class who had taken Chuck's white gi top at the start of it all was still holding it the same way he had taken it, both hands flat across his forearms, like a man holding something he understood he was going to remember holding. He had not set it down once in the last 4 minutes. He had not been told to hold it that long. Nobody had told him to do anything with it at all. He simply had not been able to make himself put it down on the ground, even folded, even on clean dirt, and so he stood there through the whole exchange between the colonel and the 800 men, a folded white gi top across 2 outstretched arms, waiting for a man to come back and take it from him the way you wait to return something borrowed from somebody important. Briggs carried his blouse across the access road, past the row of F4 Phantoms running up half a mile out, past two airmen who came to attention and held it a half-second too long because they had never seen the colonel's hands without help in them before. He carried it through the door of the officers' club, past the maitre d', who reached automatically for it and was waved off without a word. He set it down on the empty chair beside him at the table by the window, ribbons still turned in, and did not touch it again for the next hour and 40 minutes. Behind them, back on the parade ground, the young airman first class finally moved. He walked the white gi top over to Chuck's gear bag at the edge of the platform himself, since Chuck had already crossed the access road, and he laid it inside with both hands, the way you set down something you are not sure you are allowed to be the one putting away. Then he went back to formation and stood there for the dismissal, like every other man on that dirt, and he never told another airman that he had been the one holding it. Chuck ordered the chicken plate. Briggs ordered the club sandwich and the iced tea he had ordered every Friday for 9 years. They talked about Ryan, Oklahoma, the dust storms, a Methodist church, and a son at Cal State Long Beach with a brown belt. Neither man mentioned the blouse on the chair. Neither man mentioned the parade ground. The blouse sat there the whole meal, folded, ribbons in, doing nothing, the way a thing left alone on a chair does nothing, and somehow it was the loudest object at the table the entire time. When the two of them finally stood to leave, Briggs picked the blouse back up. He did not hand it to the aide waiting outside, who had been standing by the door of the officers' club for an hour and 40 minutes, without once looking through the window. He put his own arms through his own sleeves. He buttoned all 6 buttons himself, slowly, starting from the bottom, while Chuck stood across from him and said nothing, and did not look away. It took him most of a minute. His hands were not used to the buttons. 11 years of mornings, and an aide had always done the top 3. He got the last button on the collar wrong on the first try, and had to redo it. Chuck did not offer to help. Chuck understood, the way only a man who had spent a lifetime watching what people do with their hands could understand, that the buttons were not the point. The colonel was not dressing. The colonel was deciding, one button at a time, whether he was still the man who wore that blouse, and the only way to find out was to do it himself, badly, in front of the one other man on the base who had seen him without it. The aide opened the door for them both without a word. Briggs walked back across the access road in his service blouse, fully buttoned, ribbons facing out, the way 800 men had always seen him. Nobody who watched him cross that road that afternoon could have told you anything had happened at all. That was the only ending the morning was ever going to get. Not a speech. Not a salute held a half-second longer than regulation. A man putting his own uniform back on, by himself, slowly, and getting one button wrong, and 20 feet away, on a now empty patch of red dirt, a folded white gi top, sitting alone in the bottom of a gear bag, the only 2 witnesses to either object being the men who had carried them. The parade ground at Osan is still there. The asphalt went down over most of it sometime in the 80s, when the base expanded the flight line, but the section where the demonstration platform stood is still red dirt, because a drainage easement runs underneath it, and nothing heavier than foot traffic is allowed on that patch of ground. Airmen walk across it every day on their way to the chow hall. None of them know what happened on it. The dirt does not need them to know. It is just dirt, the same color it was in 1959, and the same color it was in 1970, sitting under an Air Force base on the Korean Peninsula, holding nothing, telling no one anything, the way dirt does. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. If you enjoyed this, then you'll love the stories from the behind the scenes of Chuck Norris's movies. Scan the QR code on the screen to get your copy, or visit realstoriesfromtheset.com. The book takes you on a journey. The Coliseum fight with Bruce Lee, the 4 days in the West Texas dirt with David Carradine, the squib that nearly took his eye in Manila, the helicopters that went down in the Philippines, all gathered into one place for the first time. And remember to hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.